I do like this one a lot. So my own bias is that I don't always appreciate or feel like I've nailed a story the first time out. But I feel real strongly about this one. I think I've done probably some of my best work here. That's not to say this is the best story ever written, but in comparison to all the stories I write, I feel this one is on the top end of my abilities. All right. David the Giant Killer by Jay Wilburn. The surviving brothers gathered in the packed down circle where they were chained. Shrews, the smallest of the giants, had been thinking a lot about insects lately. They were the smallest creatures he could imagine, but in mass they could strip a body down to the bones. In a way, that was very much like the human army that held them captive. They had been 5 brothers, but now they were 4. The humans left one set of bloody shackles spiked into the desert hardpan, deep into the stone below, as a reminder of why they needed to obey. Gull, the oldest and biggest brother, breathed out a prayer in their language that their human captors thought of as a demon tongue. If they caught their giant slaves speaking it, they beat them for trying to cast spells. That wasn't entirely true. They never beat the one who offended. They beat one of the brothers to punish the offender deep in his heart. The death of Ish had been Gull's punishment for trying to loosen his spike from the ground at night. Since then, he'd commanded the others to obey until he decided otherwise. Shrews sensed that his brave brother Gull would never decide otherwise again. This was where they would die. This exposed desert was where the insects and humans would pick their bones clean and then carve them into decorations for their palaces and tiny god temples to show their mighty power. Just like Ish, they were doomed. Shrews and his remaining brothers had just chosen to die slower and quieter. Saf and Lamy joined Gull in the whispering ritual to their ancestors, line after line about charity, grace, mercy, might through peace, and syrupy promises of love rolled off their fearful lips. Shrews did not join in. Louder and below in the walls of the canyon to the southeast, I'm already making some corrections, I apologize. The tiny warriors, their masters bleated threats in their harsh and clicky languages. Shrews wondered if the humans that were always fighting one another, always pushing invisible borders a few steps one way or the other, always spilling blood to fertilize their ground, or spreading salt to curse it in their gods' names, even understood their enemies' words, or if the hate was enough. The tiny steps of human masters, like the shuffling of insects' hordes, drew closer. It was time for their captors to take out their giant toys, their docile pets, their showpieces of force. Gull dropped off the prayer in mid-phrase, and Shrews' brothers lowered their heads so as not to antagonize their insect lords. The masters chittered out angry, shrill commands that Shrews could barely understand even after all this time. Gull offered out his mighty hands because what else could he possibly want? What else could they possibly want? They removed his chains without any of the fear they deserved to feel. Gull stood and accepted the oversized pieces of useless, thin, showy armor. The straps barely held, but Gull made them work. He made them work because of Ish. He made them work because he still had 3 brothers to lose. That's what held them. The chains were as much for show at this point as the golden, gilded armor plates. Shrews' eyes burned at the sight of the ivory accents in the clothing and armor pieces of their captors, who made the giants do all the work for them. Those were Ish's bones. They cut him up, probably fed his meat to their animals because giants weren't clean enough for their dirty little human mouths, and they wore the carvings of his bones to show their power as they threatened his family to control the giants and their big hearts. Shrews hated them with the dark, small hate he had previously thought only humans could feel. Being this close to them, experiencing their cruelty had poisoned Shrews' large giant soul with their small, unworthy darkness. They were close enough to grab. Humans were tough and mean for their size. Worse than stinging insects in their cruelty, their sting was done for the joy of hurting and controlling others. Still, their bones were bird thin. Their organs could only take so much punishment before they burst inside their minuscule bodies. If they had to endure a day of what they put the giant brothers of Gath through, they'd be withered and dead by sundown. He could grab their smug heads unaware, burst their brains like ripe fruit, crack their bones like sparks from a dry fire, mash them into the earth the way they did each other, generation after generation of their hateful, venomous kind. But like his brother Gull, Shrews sat back and let them do as they wished, even as they wore his dead brother's bones in front of them without fear. Suited up for the show, Gull moved toward the canyon. He cast a look back at his three brothers, still chained and spiked to the desert floor. The look conveyed love, sorrow, and warning, all the stuff of giants' poetry and prayers. As he turned away, Gull's kind face twisted into the leer of the humans wanted from him for this skit. Oh goodness, I found another typo. There you go. Sorry about that. His teeth showed through his dark beard like an animal. Like the monster the humans wanted him to be, he took up the spear made from human hands to giant proportions. He belted on the sword made large but dull for this show. He descended from sight into the canyon between the massive human armies. Saf and Lemmy stood with their chains trailing upward as far as the links would allow. Neither of them could stand their full height. Shrews watched, their eyes darting to and fro, looking for any human who might bark at them to sit again. He felt shame for his brothers, then hated himself for being so petty and human small in his soul. Shrews stood as well. He was significantly taller than the biggest human from either army, but short enough compared to his larger brothers so that he still had slack in his chains when he stood. The brothers strained to see. Shrews could peer over the edge and see Gull from the shoulders up as he reached the center of the canyon floor. At least that silenced the human chatter for a moment. Gull drew breath and laughed in a bellow that echoed between the stone walls. Shrews used to love that laugh. Now it made him sad and angry. Gull delivered his lines with gusto. He spoke as if he meant every word. The monologue wasn't even in the language of their captors, which Shrews barely understood. It was in the tongue of the captors' foes. "What does it mean?" Shrews asked. Saf said, "Curses and threats, the only poetry humans know." Lemmy added, "It is derogatory terms for their people. It is insults to their gods." "Why bother?" Shrews asked. "Make peace or make war. Why just make noise?" His eyes traced the canyon walls on both sides. How did they feed so many soldiers? Who was left to protect their homes, children, shrines, and animals? Who worked the fields or tended the livestock while so many warriors stood waiting to fight and nothing more? He would ask who made art, music, and poetry, but imagining the hateful humans having anything beautiful to say was absurd and tragic on its surface. Gull finished reciting his human threats and held out his mighty giant arms to invite war the giant brothers had no stake in. "Why aren't they calling him back like before?" Shrews finally asked. "I don't know," Saf said. "Something is happening on the other side." "Movement," Lemmy said. Shrews strained to see, but he was too short. Then they spied the single human. The man marched down the trail toward Gull alone. "Are they going to fight him?" Shrews asked. "He's armed with a sling." Saf craned his neck to see better. "He has multiple stones." "Oh no," Lemmy breathed out. "What? What does it mean?" Shrews demanded. "Projectiles," Lemmy said. "They hurl those stones with force at skulls and joints." Shrews shook his head. "Gull's armor is nothing but weak golden decoration. That helmet will not protect his head. His sword is as dull as the edge of a spoon. They didn't arm him for battle. They decorated him for bluster." Shrews' brothers stood silent at the end of their chains and watched. "He needs to run," Shrews persisted. "He won't," Saf said. That truth hit Shrews cold and heavy. He knew it before it was spoken, but the words sounded like a curse once they hung in the air. Gull was brave, but he would not run because he loved his brothers, and they would suffer if he did not obey the cowardly humans. Shrews pulled to the end of his chains. Run, Gull. Leave and we will follow. Don't die for nothing. Run, Gull. Run. Run. The armies on both sides raised their voices and growled their curses. The captors of Shrews and his brothers picked up the chant in the giant's tongue as if it were a war cry. Gull, Gull, run, Gull. Shrews hoped his brother would take their human butchering of giant words as a literal command, but he stood in place on the floor of the canyon and never raised his hands to fight. He would not bring his brothers to death, but he would not kill for the glory of the insects who carved up Ish. The human champion whirled his sling and hurled a smooth stone selected solely for its killing potential. Gull's fake helmet shattered, and the opposing army cheered like it was an act of their tiny god. Blood erupted. Here, I'd used erupted again. Blood erupted from the crushed front of Gull's forehead. He threw his head back, showed his teeth in terrible pain. He lifted the spear over his head in reflex, but both sides cheered as if Gull were putting up a fight in his death. He toppled sideways, but dropped to his knees with dull thunder and folded to his side at the feet of the human, where even Shrews could see him die. The captors went silent and recoiled. It was a sharp relief. Contrast. Again, I'm making corrections to what is supposed to be a reading, and I apologize. It was a sharp contrast to the ecstasy they showed when they butchered Ish. The opposing army, just another mob of angry, murderous humans, roared with bloodlust. Gull never drew his sword, but the human pulled it free of its scabbard and took it to Gull's throat. The blade was dull and awkward big in the human's hands, so the decapitation took forever. It was enough time for the champion's army to work itself into a frenzy. Shrews did not want to see this, but he forced himself to watch. So if the opportunity for revenge presented itself, he could spoil his giant heart with the memory and find his capacity for violence. When the tiny killer lifted Gull's head by the hair, Shrews vomited up a swill of paste and water they fed him that morning. The champion's army stormed forward. The captors dropped their weapons and fled like the cowards they were. As the opposing army of humans topped the brothers' side of the canyon, many of them pursued their human enemies. But with nowhere to hide, the surviving three brothers of Gath were easy to spot where they stood chained in the open. The insects swarmed toward them with killing force. Without a word, Saf and Lemmy picked up the large stones they used for sitting. Shrews looked about for something to fight with himself. His brothers confused him as they used the stones to hammer at the connection between Shrews' chains and his grounding spike. They alternated as if they had it planned all along. "What are you doing?" Shrews cried. They did not answer, but continued to batter the hold on their youngest brother. "They are upon us," Shrews yelled to get them to fight. There was still a little distance between them and the charging humans. Lemmy turned and hurled his large stone with as much force as the small one that slew gentle Gull. That gave the front lines pause and crushed a few of them who did not move fast enough, but the rest kept coming. Lemmy lifted the chains and opened shackles that had held Gull moments ago when the oldest brother had breathed out his last half-prayer. Lemmy swung the chains and cuffs from side to side like a great whip. It tore through the flesh and bones of the humans, but they started to flank the giant's place of captivity. "Hurry!" Lemmy cried, but Saf had never stopped pounding the links of Shrews' chains. The connecting links finally snapped and twisted loose. Shrews actually staggered backward. Saf lifted the stone as if to strike again, but instead he threw it and rolled it over the flanking move of the humans. "Run, Shrews!" Saf cried with all the passion of their former captors. "Run, run! For Gull, for Ish, for Gath, for our mother's giant soul, run!" Swords and spears pierced Lemmy and brought him to his knees. They cheered too early as he swept them back and away with his bloody palm. Then he whipped them with Gull's chains, not because he savored violence, but because he loved his brothers. Saf seized Shrews's chains and dragged his brother forward. He grabbed Shrews by the throat and brought him face to face with him. He had the youngest brother's full attention. Enough of us have died for nothing, Shrews. Get away from here so one of us lives to give this life meaning. Move your wretched feet until you are back in our kingdom, far from this place. Move before your grave joins ours with the bloody deaths of Gull and Ish. Be gone. Saf's eyes widened, and blood spilled from his lips as he arched his back. He shoved Shrews away, and the youngest giant staggered. Saf turned his back on Shrews and never laid eyes on him again. His back looked like it was sprouting quills with all the weapons buried there. Shrews gathered his chains so as not to trip. He fled like a cowardly human. Saf lifted the stained chains of Ish. Lemmy took to his feet again, and the giants punished the humans for all they had done, even as the brothers bled out their last. Shrews looked away so he would not see when they fell. He preferred to remember them in their triumph instead of cut apart like Ish and Gull. As he ran, Shrews encountered more humans. They were busy slaughtering each other, but many were happy to turn on the fleeing giant and pursue. Each turn Shrews tried to make only brought him to more enemies. He took the foothills and then the first mountains, but they would not relent. What they lacked in size, power, speed, and morality, they made up for in hateful, unending endurance. Shrews found himself corralled into a dead-end rock. He stared up the column of stone at the ledge that was high above even his head. Spears bounced off the narrow rock walls. Small stones peppered his aching back and reminded him of his dead brother. Shrews braced his hands and feet on the rocky walls of the column and attempted to scale to safety using counter-pressure. The stones hit him and bloodied his knuckles. They didn't even bother throwing their spears. They just poked him like a trapped pig. He cried out with all his rage and sorrow, shaking the stone he climbed. They responded with laughter and their endless string of human curses. As his strength gave out, his soul had had enough. Shrews turned as he dropped. Whatever they saw in his face in that moment filled them with fear finally. This brought him dark joy, and he unleashed ungiant-like fury upon them. He took many sharp wounds, but he crushed them, bent them backwards, ripped them legs from torso, and beat them to death with the bodies of their friends. In time he grew woozy and stumbled. The bodies of dead men piled high, but they kept coming, as the deadliest insects tended to do. Shrews fought and fought until he was blind with exhaustion and blood loss. He fell to his knees, fell to his back, still clawing and flailing into their sharp weapons. When he awoke, it was morning, and all the bodies that covered him were wet with dew and old sticky wounds. It took him nearly an hour to remember himself and to realize he wasn't dead. He rolled the bodies off of him and struggled to his knees. The smell of death and spoiled blood mixed with the evacuated bowels to create a slaughterhouse swill that made his weary eyes water. He had many cuts, but they appeared closed. A few were angry and pink around the edges. A couple opened back up as he stood. Shrews slogged through the corpses and out of the dead end. He listened for their tiny voices, but heard nothing except the poetry of birds. His mind moved slowly, but he finally said, "They think I'm dead too." If that were true, they wouldn't be looking for him if he could avoid them now. He tried for a few moments to use the tiny discarded swords to free himself from the shackles and chains, but it was no good. It had taken 2 of his older brothers to free him before. 3 of his brothers had died in chains. 1 died on the field of someone else's battle, not because he was a poor warrior, but because in the end he refused violence in the purest of giant tradition. Shrews decided in that moment he would honor them by surviving. He would run until he found a hammer large enough to break these cursed chains. Once they were off, he would never allow them to be placed upon him or any other giant ever again. This was his oath in the names of Gull, Ish, Lemmy, Saf, and all of Gath. Shrews turned away from the place of their captivity and limped through the mountains in what small victory the giant could claim from all this.